Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to this next event in BPI's Building Public Interest series. I'm Amy Thompson, Staff Counsel and Polikoff-Gautreaux Fellow at BPI. BPI is an independent public interest law and policy center where we address compelling racial and social justice issues that impact the Chicago region and the state of Illinois. Through our advocacy, we work to drive racial, social, and economic justice through a focus on police accountability, reform of the criminal legal system, housing and community development, and education and early learning. To work towards systemic change, that is, to make systems more equitable, we collaborate with community partners to ensure that those living in under-resourced communities have access to life opportunities. It's our vision that all people have the right and opportunity to live their fullest life free of systemic barriers. We believe that sharing information within our community and staying abreast of all the issues that contribute to pervasive structural inequities is essential to this work, which is why we created Building Public Interest, a series that sets out to inform, to educate, and to activate a wide and diverse audience around issues of social justice, racial equity, and their inherent intersection with other areas of concern that impact us all. We take our inspiration in this series to this intersectional approach from American civil rights activist Audre Lorde, who famously said, "There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives." Today's discussion is one that illustrates the importance of looking across issues to understand systems that promote the elimination of systemic barriers to racial, social, and economic equity. BPI's work is not limited to, but it really is grounded in the city of Chicago. The city is large, with about 2.7 million residents spanning 77 community areas and 100 neighborhoods. It's also a large government with an annual budget of $16.7 million, dozens of city agencies, and nearly 30,000 employees, with about half police and fire departments alone. In short, ensuring that the government of the city of Chicago is working effectively, efficiently, and with integrity is truly, and to truly serve the people of the city is incredibly important work for justice and equity. So we're pleased then to have an opportunity to be in conversation with the person leading the work to ensure just that. We're excited to welcome Deborah Witzburg. Deborah Witzburg currently serves as the Inspector General for the City of Chicago, having been appointed to her first term in April 2022. Previously, she served as the Deputy Inspector General for Public Safety, overseeing independent, objective evaluations and reviews of the Chicago Police Department, the Civilian Office of Police Accountability, and the Police Board, with the goal of enhancing the effectiveness of public safety, protecting civil liberties and civil rights, and increasing the public's confidence in the system. She also served as the OIG's chief investigator for the public safety section, leading efforts to screen and review closed police disciplinary cases, as well as the OIG's Associate General Counsel for Public Safety, advising on legal and constitutional matters related to oversight of Chicago's police and police accountability agencies. Witzburg first joined the OIG in 2016 as an Assistant Inspector General, providing legal and strategic counsel for investigations of misconduct by City of Chicago employees. Witzburg previously served as an Assistant State's Attorney for the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, where she prosecuted a wide range of misdemeanor and felony cases. She served in the State's Attorney's Community Justice Center, focusing on the vertical prosecution of cases of greatest concern in Chicago's 11th and 12th police districts. There, she helped develop and institute crime prevention programs in partnership with schools, senior citizens groups, and neighborhood organizations. She is accredited as a certified practitioner of oversight by the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. Witzburg also earned her BA in anthropology from Brown University and a JD from Northwestern University School of Law. Our BPI Executive Director, Cara Hendrickson, will be interviewing Deborah, so I'll turn it over to her. But before I do, please know that we will reserve time for questions from the audience. So feel free, if at any point during the program, to add your questions to Deborah using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And I'll hand it over to Cara.
Amy, thank you so much. Deborah, welcome. It's nice to be here with you this afternoon.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We're really excited to be in conversation with you, Deborah. Amy told us a little bit about why your role in your office is so important. I'm hoping that we can start out our conversation today just hearing a little bit more from you about what your mandate is and what it means. And I was hoping we might kick off that conversation with actually some of the words of your office and some of your own words. So the mandate of your office, the mission, is to promote economy, efficiency, effectiveness, and integrity in the administration of programs and operations of the government of the city of Chicago. That's a big mission, a large mission. Obviously, after you were selected earlier this year, as Amy shared with us, you were asked about that mission and asked about the scope of it. And you stated that you intend to occupy every corner of the legal mandate of your office. So start us off this afternoon by telling us, what does your office do? What does it mean to occupy every corner of the legal mandate of the Office of the Inspector General?
Well, I thank you for having me, and thank you for the question. I think that is a good place to start. The legal mandate of the Office of Inspector General is a very broad one, exactly as you described. And we work in the service of that mission by conducting comprehensive oversight of the operations and programs of city government. We really do that in three channels. We do investigative work dealing with misconduct by city actors. We do program and policy work, looking at whether pieces of city government are operating as effectively and efficiently as they might. And we do data analysis and presentation, both for its own sake and in the service of some of our other work. And so those, across those sort of three channels of work, we aim to exercise this sort of integrative, comprehensive oversight. When it comes to the question of occupying all of the spaces of our mandate, that really is just an observation of the breadth of that mandate and the various ways in which we might get at it and the various ways in which we might serve our mission. The office is empowered to do a lot of different things, some of them the things we just talked about. We are also empowered to do some things which we have historically not yet gotten to. For example, the office is empowered to conduct public hearings on any matter which is the subject of an OIG inquiry. We have not done that ourselves. That's something that I look forward to our doing.
Thanks. Deborah, can you talk a little bit more about, you listed out three areas of work that the office does: investigative work, program and policy, and data analysis. Tell us a little bit about how issues come to you, how you determine what your agenda will be in those areas.
Through many different ways. And we are always aiming to engage more and more deeply and more often with those who know best what is going wrong in city government. We have people contact us directly with sort of complaints and concerns and suggestions and ideas in huge volumes, something on the order of a couple of thousand intakes per quarter. We do sort of subject matter specific outreach to community groups and to stakeholders. We're in very close contact with elected and appointed officials in the city and with city employees. I think those people are often positioned to know best sort of how things are working and what's going wrong. And we engage in forums like this one, where we are sort of in conversation with people who are doing advocacy work around issues which relate to our mission.
And I know, Deborah, while you were just appointed to this role in April of this year, you are not new to the work of this office, having served in the office in a number of previous roles, including as the Public Safety Inspector General. Tell us a little bit about that prior experience in this role and how it has shaped what priorities you're bringing now that you sit in this seat.
Yeah, I think, I am very grateful to come to this job having had the various other experiences in this office that I've had. And I think really for two reasons. One, because it is such a high priority for me that we do kind of well integrated interdisciplinary work, that we are using all of the various tools at our disposal in-house at OIG to best attack the problems of government oversight. And so having seen many of those OIG functions up close and from the inside is of tremendous service to me. Specifically with respect to police oversight, I think it is sort of an immovable truth that for the foreseeable future, police reform and public safety will be at the top of the list of priorities of Chicagoans, both members of the public and members of the city government. And so that is an area where I'm grateful to have had, very in-depth experience. And that's a set of issues which is obviously very close to my heart. I think, I'm really committed to OIG continuing to drive a police reform conversation in Chicago, and specifically to move that conversation into a recognition that reforming our police department and keeping people safe are not mutually exclusive alternatives, but in fact necessary correlates of each other. I think, we need to move the conversation in Chicago to a place where we recognize that we are not choosing between reforming the police and keeping people safe, but rather that we can only keep people safe by reforming the police department.
Yeah. I hear that. And I know that we're going to talk, I hope we will, quite a lot this afternoon about public safety and policing. Before we get there, I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about some of the other work that the office has done and maybe other priorities that might be on your radar screen going forward. Amy shared with us some background information about the city of Chicago. You know it well. You are doing this work not in any office of Inspector General, but in the office of the Inspector General of the city of Chicago, a city that has its own unique assets, its own unique challenges. One reputation that the city sometimes has is as a place that has a lack of integrity or corruption in city operations. So I'd like to talk with you about that. We see indictments in city council members, for example. I'm interested both in your perception about that reputation that the city of Chicago has. How do you see the city sitting in that space? And what is the role of your office in addressing that issue?
Yeah. I think Chicago certainly does have that reputation. And I think one of the ways I've talked about this is this notion that the city of Chicago operates at a debt of legitimacy with its residents, generations in the making. And I think in oversight work, we have an obligation to sort of situational awareness. We have an obligation to do our work in a way that is cognizant of all of the things that you said, of the context in which we're doing it, and that Chicago is not any city, but that we come to this work carrying the burden of our history when it comes to mistrust in government. And I think in terms of our office's role, I think of our responsibility here as kind of making payments against that debt of legitimacy. That's not a debt that we pay to zero in the space of an election cycle or a term or a career, probably, frankly. This is a generations long arc of reform. But that's how I see our obligation against that backdrop. And that drives my thinking about how we should prioritize our work, in that I would like us to be directing our attention and our resources to those problems which do the most injury to public trust in government, and which are the kind of primary drivers of a lack of legitimacy and a lack of trust in government.
Can you give us examples of what those are? When you're thinking about what is a problem that does the most injury, that is the most likely to yield, I think, as you might say, the highest payment in service of this debt against legitimacy. What factors are you weighing? What are you thinking about? How do you evaluate that question?
Yeah, this is the sort of day-to-day challenge of how we prioritize our work and allocate our resources. I have one general and one more specific example, maybe. As a general matter, I would say transparency for transparency's sake, I think, goes a long way here. There is a lot of work to do in bringing sunlight to the windowless rooms of city government. And I think we direct a lot of time and attention toward ensuring that decisions by city officials are being made in the light of day, where we can at least have a well-informed public conversation that drives accountability in decision making. And that's about transparency. That's about allowing people to see what is happening, how city government is operating. More specifically, and this is on my mind particularly kind of given where we are in the year, we are kind of reimagining a bit our work around campaign finance oversight. I think one of the drivers, one of the contributors to this debt of legitimacy and a driver of the kind of sense of mistrust in government is the impression that City Hall is for sale. And so we are kind of reinvesting, as I say, in our efforts to make sure that everybody's following the rules when it comes to campaign donations.
And so if we can just follow on that example for a minute, when you decide that that's an area where, as you say, I think there's an important place to focus. Mm-hmm. How do you do that? Do you do that through taking in complaints that you receive from the public? Do you do it through building out systems that create transparency where it does not exist? Do you do it? Tell us a little bit more about the tools that you consider using, and if you're able to, the tools that you're considering using with respect to campaign finance in particular.
Sure. There are really three pieces of how, some combination of how we do this work and how we are going to do it going forward. One is certainly through the intake of complaints. And that's a little bit about awareness raising, that, I want people to know that one of the things we want to hear from them about is whether they have concerns around campaign donations and campaign finance irregularities and so on. So certainly the intake of complaints from people. The second is around proactive data analysis. So there are certain classes of contributions and contributors to political campaigns which are restricted by the ethics rules and other sources of authority. And so that allows for some amount of proactive data analysis on our part, looking at, who belongs to those groups of, for example, restricted contributors, and what contributions they're making, and ensuring that none of the contributions those restricted contributors are making kind of fall afoul of the rules. So that there's an opportunity for, as I say, proactive data analysis there. And the third point goes to your comment about just the transparency of this process. And I would say, I think where we are with that is that we are looking at ways to make more transparent who falls into these restricted categories and why, so that information is more available to members of the public.
You've talked a couple times about data analysis. Can you paint for us a picture about what that looks like? Tell us a little bit about your team, what kind of capacity your office has for data. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about work that you've done in data in the past that people may not be familiar with, and whether you see past work that your office has done as a model, for additional work that we might expect to see coming out of your office, or if there have been lessons learned, ways you'd like to do that data work differently.
Yeah, absolutely. So our data analysis is done out of our Center for Information Technology and Analytics. And that component of the office has both an outward and an inward facing component. The inward facing piece of that work is that the data scientists there, who have a range of skill sets, and many of them have sort of STEM-based advanced degrees and come to this work from data science and predictive analytics backgrounds. Some of their work is in the service of our program and policy work internally. And so they are providing data analysis, which then becomes a component of our project work, and sometimes our investigative work as well, I should say. The outward facing component of that work comes to live in our information portal, which is available through OIG's website. That's igchicago.org. And the information portal is a piece of that website. And the information portal is a series of dashboards, which are manipulatable by users to kind of visualize and make accessible city data. And so those are powered by direct backend access to city databases across a really wide spectrum of kind of subject matters. And then they're rendered available for public use and analysis and viewing there. And, I think those dashboards sort of serve a couple of purposes. They are intentionally flexible enough that users can kind of apply their own questions of interest to the data that's available there. They also provide, what we view as some really important high-level conclusions. Many of those are police and public safety focused, not all of them. There are others that focus on city finances, et cetera. And they, we have a lot of mapping functions. I think geography and equity are so closely tied in Chicago. We try whenever possible to give kind of a geographic dimension to those. So much of that work lives there. I think in terms of how this looks going forward, in addition to building out this campaign finance proactive analysis piece that we just talked a little bit about, I see us moving further into predictive analytics, both in the service of our policy work and our investigative work, and thinking through how we prioritize resources, again, how we decide what to look at when, if we can kind of, get a clearer forecast of problems that might be to come, I think that will aid us in making those decisions about prioritization.
Deborah, I'm so interested in your comment about predictive analytics. And wondering if you can say a little, so I am a lawyer by training. Many of our audience today are going to be policy analysts or lawyers or community activists who may not be familiar with predictive analytics. Tell us a little bit about how you might use that kind of technology to anticipate either trends. Are we talking about, using that sort of technology to identify issues or particular problematic actors? How would you use that technology to guide the scope of your work?
I think this is very much still in formation and very much still kind of in a brainstorming phase around lots of questions, including the ones that you raise. The way I am mostly thinking about this is sort of issue spotting, being able to identify from various trends where we are likely to see sort of pain points for people in areas including, the provision of city services and, gaps in service, sort of things like that. So I'm imagining this mostly on the dimension of kind of issue spotting. There's also obviously potential, as you say, to identify high risk actors. There's sort of social network type analysis, early intervention sorts of systems. Some of those, I will say, incidentally, the city is required to do under the consent decree with respect to the police department. So some potential exists there as well. This is in early phases here internally.
We look forward to hearing and learning more about that. It sounds like, Deborah, that if I am someone who's interested in getting data about city operations, I want to know about city hiring or city employment, public safety in the city, that your website should be a stop on my research journey,
Yes.
including both for data and for mapping purposes.
Yes, absolutely.
Fantastic. You talked a minute ago about the linking between geography and equity in the city of Chicago, and one observation you made is, that causes you all to often use mapping tools to share the information that you're sharing with the public. Can you say more about that? And the question is really, when you're examining an issue, whether it's an investigation related to a particular complaint or city employee, or you're looking at your policy and program work, how do you decide how you share out what you learn? Tell us a little bit about your reporting obligations and the choices that you make about how to share that information with the public.
Sure. So with respect to how we report the work that we do, there is sort of a bright line there between our investigative work and our program and policy work. Our investigative work is confidential by ordinance. We, conduct both administrative and criminal investigations into misconduct by city actors. That work is confidential by ordinance. It kind of meets the public view in a couple of different ways. When we conduct criminal investigations in partnership with prosecuting agencies, those investigations sometimes result in charging, and that is a public event. Our administrative investigations are summarized in de-identified form in the office's quarterly reports as prescribed by the municipal code of the city. Our program and policy work is very different when it comes to public reporting in that it is designed to be public facing. And so the way that those projects work is that we conduct an inquiry, we publish the findings of that inquiry, and where it includes recommendations, we send those recommendations to the relevant city department, we get a response, and then we publish all of that alongside our findings. So that a published report out of our program and policy efforts will include OIG's findings, our recommendations, and the responses of the relevant city agency. And that is, again, that's a transparency-driven process. That is like a conversation in the light of day.
That's great. Deborah, I'm going to remind people who joined us later in the program that they can submit questions to you in the Q&A function. We will reserve time at the end for everyone to ask questions. In the meantime, want to follow up just again on this, the geography and equity question, and I want to turn to talking about tax increment financing, TIF. TIF is the City of Chicago's primary funding vehicle for economic development. For those in our audience who don't know, it uses local property taxes to finance public and private projects that are designed to reduce urban blight by improving infrastructure, expanding the tax base, and or fostering economic development. I think that is some legal language around what we are supposed to be using TIF dollars for in the city of Chicago. And your office has, over the past few years, conducted reviews of the city's use of TIF financing. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that. Some of that compliance work that you all have done has been to look at compliance with sunshine laws, for example, and the accountability and accounting of funds that are held for TIF projects. So for people who may be interested in equitable community development in the city of Chicago, can you tell us a little bit about why we should be interested? Why we're talking about TIF funds? Why is that relevant to a conversation about equitable community development in the city of Chicago, and why your office might be interested in looking at it?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question, both with respect to TIF specifically and as it serves for kind of an exemplar or a proxy for some of these larger issues that we're talking about. So the work that we've done most recently about TIF has to do with, as you say, whether the city is complying with the Sunshine Ordinance, which requires the public availability of a wide variety of pieces of information about TIF spending. And then also the other piece of that recent inquiry had to do with the handling of and accounting for surplus dollars, unspent TIF dollars in a given year. So we published a report, the kind of report we talked about with recommendations and findings, recommendations and responses earlier this year. We also have a corresponding dashboard on the information portal that looks at TIF dollars that includes some mapping. So to take for a second the sort of mapping question, one of the things we often talk about internally is that when it comes to identifying problems in Chicago, whether that is, gaps in city service or violent crime rates or lots of other problems, we often say that there is one heat map of Chicago and you can change the title on it a lot of different ways. Race and socioeconomic status and geography are really closely tied in the city of Chicago. And for that reason, mapping is a really useful equity tool. So when we look at the way, for example, that investigatory stops by the police or uses of force by the police are distributed across the city, the concentration of those things looks very different in South and West Side districts than it does in North Side districts, for example. And so, mapping, I think, is a really important equity exercise because of sort of the profile of the city, because of the way the city looks and then the way its neighborhoods are constituted. With respect to TIF, so this TIF dashboard that we have does include some mapping, and I think, again, in thinking about TIF, as of interest both for its own sake and as kind of an example or an exemplar, interesting for a number of reasons. I think transparency around TIF information provides the opportunity for the kind of accountable decision-making that we talked about a few minutes ago. I think there's an opportunity to look at the way TIF dollars are being allocated and ask questions about whether those allocations seem to align with stated priorities of government. And so we say, we can sort of look at the messages that are out there in terms of what we are prioritizing and where we are prioritizing, and then looking at the way TIF dollars are allocated and providing an opportunity to sort of compare those things for purposes of transparent and accountable decision making by city actors. I think that alignment with priority, and then the question of geographic allocation. I think that's why people should care about that specifically, and those I think are the opportunities that are kind of teed up by increased data access, both in the form of our recommendations to city agencies in our report and our own data dashboard.
And I want to pick up on that last point about the utility of the information that you're providing. TIF dollars are big. This is big money in the city of Chicago, right? This is one of the largest sources of funding for economic development in the city of Chicago. We are on one end of a spectrum in terms of the degree to which we rely on TIF funding in the city. And so let's say you were addressing an audience of advocates and people who care about community and economic development, as you are in this webinar, what advice would you give to people who are not in the IG's office, right? Who have the ability to go to your website and look at the map for TIF funding or on other issues as well? Where do people outside of the IG's office pick up the ball and take that information and move it forward? If you had a magic wand and you could give advice to people who want to complement or supplement or lift up the transparency and sunshine work that you are doing on an issue like TIF, for example, what advice would you give?
I think, again, here there's both a sort of a general answer and maybe a couple of specific examples. In general, one of the ways I think about our transparency work is to do it in the service of getting us to a better informed public policy conversation. We would all be better off. Advocates, decision makers, stakeholders, all around an issue would all be better off if the public policy conversation in which we are engaged was kind of better informed by a shared, reliable, robust set of data points. If we were all playing with the same deck, we would be better off. We would be better off. And so that is, as a general matter, how I think about some of this work, particularly our work where we don't necessarily include recommendations. And there are some recent specific examples of that kind of work, including some of our work around search warrants, some of our work around ShotSpotter. That work was really explicitly pointed in this direction of providing good and clear information for use by advocates and stakeholders in a policy conversation. So I think that's sort of the general observation. More specifically, I think one of the ways that our work could have more practical impact would be through more regular and immediate legislative hearings on our work. So one of the landing places for OIG program and policy products is in hearings before the Chicago City Council. Sometimes there are some situations in which a hearing on our work is mandatory. So for example, work coming out of our public safety section, the municipal code requires that on a request by at least 3 aldermen that there be a hearing on a public safety section report. It has historically been something of an uphill battle to get those hearings on the calendar, even where they are required. And where they're not required, I think they are still of tremendous value in terms of kind of, frankly, calling people on the carpet from an accountability perspective and in moving the ball forward in terms of a public conversation. And so I think for advocates and stakeholders who can kind of, pull in the direction of that kind of use of our work, I think that would increase its impact.
Deborah, how often does it happen that when your office, if it's possible to generalize, that you do a report that's not a public safety report, that you do have a legislative hearing in the city council, if there is a public hearing in the appropriate committee on the work? Is that the exception more than the rule, or are we just talking about some little gaps to fill in?
It is categorically the exception that there is a hearing on an OIG report.
Are there other fora currently where there, I know your report is published, it's public, it's on your website. You've talked with us about dashboards. Other than legislative hearings, which sound like are the exception rather than the rule, are there other, public airings on your reports typically? Are there other city agencies that pick them up and talk about them? Or is this really just an area where there's an opportunity to grow and expand the effectiveness of the work?
There are enormous opportunities here, no two ways about it. There are sometimes other public airings of our work. We do a lot of engagement with interested stakeholders. I often say I will go anywhere I'm invited, and some places I'm not, to talk about our work and to listen, more importantly, to what people have to say about it. So we do a lot of engagement with community groups around our work, both in its, in the work, in the course of doing it and after it's published. I also think, we talked a little bit about at the beginning of our conversation about the fact that we are empowered to hold our own public hearings. I do think that will be an important way to advance public conversation about our work.
Well, you've mentioned policing a few times. Let's talk a little bit about the policing part of your work. Obviously, an area in which you have yourself significant experience, and as you say, an important part of city government. Let's start by just, if we could, for our audience, just setting the stage about from the perspective of the city expenditure, the city budget, just sort of the size of the city government, why policing is an important area of city services for us to be talking about. So your office has done some work, again, on transparency and providing some information to the public just about the size of the budget. You reported that each city resident spends about $620 a year in tax dollars to support the police department. Help us set the stage a little bit just about the relative size of the department with respect to the rest of the city government, and how it fits into the larger operation of city services.
Yeah. The police department, even before we get to the obvious fact that it looms that the way we conduct policing looms very large in terms of the life and safety and quality of life of Chicagoans, just in terms of the kind of structure of city government, as you say, a couple of things to say. The police department is the largest city department by a lot, both in terms of number of employees and number of dollars. The police department employs something in the neighborhood of 13,000 of the about 30,000 city employees. It is more than twice as big as the next biggest department in terms of employees. In terms of dollars spent, it is also by a lot has the largest allocation of city dollars among city departments. And so it looms very, very large. I will interrupt myself briefly to say the way the police department budget is constructed is very complicated, both in terms of inflow and outflow of money. And so there are and should be lots of questions out in the public conversation about the funding of the police department, how much funding is the right amount, what we should be funding, where those dollars are coming from and where they're going, et cetera. It's, I think, very hard to have that conversation at the level at which it would be most productive without the kind of shared deck, without the kind of shared information that we've been talking about. In the interest of improving that situation, we published last year, and we're about to publish again for this year, a sort of explainer on CPD's budget, where we just sort of put out there some just descriptive information and numbers about the money that goes into CPD's budget from city funds and grants, et cetera, and where those dollars go out. And so I encourage people to take a look at that kind of budget explainer. Last year's is up on our website. This year's is forthcoming. So that, CPD really is an outlier in the city, in the scope of the city's government for all of those reasons. I will also say, however, in terms of how we think about its operation and how we think about reforming its outcomes, I do think it's really important to view CPD as part of an ecosystem rather than in a silo. The criminal justice system and the public safety system at the city level is in fact an ecosystem. It is a multi-component system. It includes even just within city government, the police department and the Office of Emergency Management and Communication and the fire department and the Office of Public Safety Administration and OIG and the Civilian Office of Police Accountability and the new Civilian Commission. There are a lot of relevant components. And so while I think it is critically important to know and think about the way the police department is structured as a department, it's also really important to keep in mind that it doesn't function. It doesn't live on an island.
And that ecosystem is large, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the fire department is the second largest city agency, for example, right? When we think about that ecosystem, it is significant, just purely by the numbers, but also really, as you say, and rightly point out, because of the life and safety implications of the work that the department is charged to do. I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about some of the issues that you all have taken a look at from a life and safety and effectiveness of the police department perspective. And I'd like to start with search warrants. So in December of 2020, video footage of a 2019 raid of Anjanette Young's home was released. I'm sure our viewers will remember that raid was the result of a search warrant based on a tip of a single source. The video showed officers bursting through Ms. Young's door seconds after knocking, handcuffing her, leaving her to stand naked in front of all male police officers, as she repeatedly pleaded with them that she was in the wrong home. Your office, following that raid, has been conducting an inquiry into CPD's execution of search warrants, and you've published 2 reports about search warrants. Tell us a little bit about what questions you've been looking at with respect to search warrants and their execution by CPD, and what have you found?
I will say first that I think this is an area where it's particularly important to sort of thoughtfully distinguish between our investigative work and our program and policy work. So, separate from investigative work related to the specific incident which you describe, our public safety section has been conducting a sort of long-running program and policy-based inquiry having to do with, more broadly, CPD's use of and execution of search warrants. And as you described, coming out of that program and policy work, in recognition in part of the complexity of the issue and the urgency of solving some of these problems, we have issued a couple of interim reports coming out of that inquiry. We continue to head toward a kind of a final, at least for the moment, report on that subject, which is sort of coming soon. But the 2 reports that we have issued so far, two different sets of things. The first of those reports made urgent recommendations around CPD's internal policies, internal directive on search warrant executions. And those recommendations were that CPD's policy be modified to improve requirements for the corroboration of information which would serve as the basis for a search warrant, as the predicate information for a search warrant, to ensure, or to, with the aim of ensuring that search warrants are based on accurate information, to reduce the risk of bad outcomes. And the second recommendation had to do with expanding the circumstances under which CPD members are required to report problematic search warrant executions for disciplinary purposes. So we made those 2 sort of urgent recommendations. CPD accepted both of them and included responsive changes in a series of other changes to its internal directive earlier this year. The second of our interim reports was a descriptive data exercise, sort of the sort that we've been talking about. Did not include recommendations, but was just a data analysis. And that product looked at all search warrants served by CPD from 2017 through 2020. And we looked at a variety of dimensions of that population of information, including demographic considerations. That allowed us to draw a number of high-level observations, including, for example, that Black males were overwhelmingly the targets of search warrants executed during that period of time.
So we're really talking about 3 levels really of tools here, Deborah, right? One, you rightly distinguish between investigations that relate to particular city actors, right? So when there is a particular incident or there's a complaint perhaps with respect to a particular city actor, your office has the ability to investigate focused on that specific incident. But you've really described, 2 other larger tools that you've used with respect to search warrants. One, making recommendations for improvements or changes in CPD policies. And the other, again, providing data. This is the show, don't tell strategy, right? Where you put the data out there and the conclusions are we hope ones that can be drawn by the readers. Can we just talk about those last 2 strategies for a second? And my question is really about effectiveness. And when you use the strategy of, for example, looking at execution of search warrants over a number of years, and you draw the kinds of conclusions that you've just briefly shared with us, do you find that doing that analysis, that putting forward the patterns that you see, without the connection to specific policy recommendations, is effective, that there are changes that result from those reports, and search warrants might be an example. Has there been action by the department or some of the other actors in the ecosystem after that conclusion, or just generally, whether that's a strategy that moves the needle?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is a strategy that moves the needle in a couple of ways. The two ways that come to mind for me are, one, I think that sort of descriptive data analysis deprives everybody of the sort of like safe harbor of ungrounded assumptions, right? So we can't kind of come to a policy conversation with unexamined predicate assumptions if we have clear data which undermines those assumptions or supports them, in fact, right? We're better served by knowing what the information actually tells us rather than by assuming what it might tell us. The other thing is that I think this sort of analysis provides a really important baseline. So this is a consent decree governed era of police reform management, and where we have I'm not sure rapidly evolving, but where we have an evolving landscape in terms of the rules by which policing is conducted, I think we're well served by knowing what the baseline looks like so that we can assess the real world impact of some of the policy changes that are at work here, including consent decree driven reforms. We had a conversation in the city council last week about the progress of consent decree reform. And one of the things I said then, which I will say again now, is that, real reform happens on the street and not on the paper. And so as we are thinking about what does consent decree reform look like and how much progress are we making, we need to be able to measure that in a meaningful way. And we can't measure progress if we don't know where we started. And so that sort of knowing where we're starting is, I think, one of the purposes of this sort of descriptive data work.
Let me ask you about, seeing that reform on the street and some other work that you all have done that really is just impacting the lives of people in the city of Chicago every day. And I want to ask you about police stops. Your office conducted an evaluation of police stops and use of force. And in particular, you looked at the racial and ethnic disparities in those stops. You published a report on this topic as well. And I think it's really interesting that you really looked at a lot of different points in time during a stop. A stop is not just one event. There's several decision points in the stop occurrences. And so can you tell us a little bit about that investigation into police stops, how you did it and what you found?
Yeah, exactly as you say, that report endeavored to look at a contact between a member of the public and a member of the police department sort of over its life cycle, including initial contact, whether there was a use of force, how much force in terms of severity, how many instances of force, whether there were force mitigation efforts, efforts to avoid the use of force, and so on. And we looked at this was an equity-driven analysis. We looked at the racial and ethnic pieces of these contacts and found that where disparities existed across this life cycle of a contact between a member of the public and a member of the department, where disparities exist, those disparities disadvantage Black people, which is to say, where we see racial and ethnic disparities in terms of who is getting stopped and who is the subject of force and how severe that force is, those disparities disadvantage Black people in those interactions in ways that are not explained by the overlay of crime rates in district of occurrence, given the demographic considerations around the geography, as we talked about. So that is to say, we see Black subjects being overrepresented in each of those stages of interaction and use of force and level of force used. We also found some areas where there was not evidence of disparity. So for example, we did not see evidence of racial or ethnic disparity in the employment of force mitigation techniques. So the police department has laid out a series of tools, that can be used to avoid using force. And from the department's data on those, we did not see evidence of demographic disparities there. That report did not include recommendations. That was another of the sort of descriptive data endeavors that we've talked about. And I think that is probably the best example of this baseline setting function of the work. So the period of time during which we studied data for that use of force project predated the consent decree driven reform and rewriting of the police department's suite of policies on the use of force. And I think, I look forward to the opportunity for the city, whether that's us or the department or in some collaboration, to repeat this analysis for a period of time after those new policies went into effect. And I think we will then be really well positioned to determine whether changes in the force policies and in improvements in kind of trainings around bias policing and so on have had a real impact, have had an equity impact on the outcomes.
Because we know we're starting with disparities. We know,
That's
I mean, you're, as you say, despite some areas like when officers will make efforts not to use force, your report did show racial disparities in police stops, and so there's some urgency to move forward in those reform efforts and to do the data analysis to see if they're working. Another place where, again, we see and grapple with this intersection of public safety and equity and policing is in the shot spotter technology. So let's talk a little bit about what that is. It gets some headlines and what you've learned about it. So, this is a gunshot detection system that's technology. It uses a network of sensors to locate and identify acoustically suspected gunshots. And then there's a brief process of human review. And then those reports are sent to OEMC, the city agency that you mentioned earlier, that can dispatch CPD officers in response to alerts. And so CPD officers are sent to the scene of suspected gunfire, in part triggered by this shot spotter system. And so tell us a little bit about how big is this system? Should we be interested in and concerned about it? If so, why? What have you learned in your investigation about shot spotter technology?
We looked at ShotSpotter. I think there's an important distinction to be made here, which is that we did not study the technological accuracy of the ShotSpotter system. But we did not look at the question of how good the system is at discerning the sound of gunfire as distinguished from other loud noises, right? That's a technological question which we did not endeavor to answer. The question that we looked at was the question of operational value, how and to what effect CPD is using the ShotSpotter technology in the service of, fighting and preventing violent crime. And we found a couple of things. So first, with respect to the question of how big this is and whether we should care about it, I mean, the answer is yes. I think, this is something of interest. ShotSpotter sensors are in use in something like 12 of the city's police districts, so about half of the city's police districts. The city originally purchased this technology by way of a 3-year, $33 million contract. So it's a lot of city dollars. Before the expiration of that contract term, it was extended by the city with further financial investment in the technology. I will say this is a law enforcement tool about which we hear a lot of concern from community members. And so in terms of this question about operational value, we looked at how often CPD's data demonstrates investigative proceeds, a law enforcement benefit arising out of a response to a ShotSpotter alert. And what we found is that the data, CPD's data, only very rarely demonstrates investigative proceeds arising from the response to a ShotSpotter alert. Only in about 9% of those responses is there discernible from the data, some evidence developed of a gun-related crime. That's not to say that those are the only situations in which there is an investigative benefit. It is to say that if there is more investigative benefit than that, CPD isn't capturing it in its data. And so I think that, that's an important consideration for decisions about whether we continue to invest city dollars. And so the purpose of that work really was, again, in the direction of kind of better informing stakeholders in making a cost benefit determination where we're spending a lot of dollars and incurring a lot of community concern. Is the law enforcement benefit sufficient to outweigh those costs?
And indeed, on the cost benefit calculation that you all did, and in addition to the monetary cost of the program, the size of the program, the data that you just reported, I think you all also articulated that one outcome of use of the technology may also be that it changed the way some CPD members perceive and interact with individuals who are present in the areas where the ShotSpotter alerts are present. So there's a question of, in addition to the public safety outcomes, the interactions, that people have with officers when they are deployed as a result of the alert of this system. So lots of really important data and consequences for the public to consider based on your report. Deborah, I could talk to you about public safety for probably the next 3 hours, but conscious of your time and of our audience's time, I want to just ask you a broad question to close us. And that's just about our large civic and public discourse and your thoughts about, as we look forward and set our civic agenda going forward and think about the issues that we should really be prioritizing as an informed civic community that is deeply invested in this city that we all call home. What issues do you think should be on our collective radar screen as you invest in efficiency and effectiveness and integrity in our city government, and you interact with people who also share those values? What issues would you put on our radar screen to really prioritize as we look forward? This will be your closing advice to the rest of us in the audience of this conversation.
I think I am a profound believer in the power of government to do good and the power of local government particularly. Local municipal government has the potential to play an enormous role in the everyday lives of people. And that's what makes its effective operation so important. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about how we can, as we've been talking about today, how we can sort of light the way by which city services are delivered to Chicagoans. I think the responsibility that all of us in this space share is to make our government more closely resemble the transparent and accountable government which Chicagoans deserve.
Well, that's a tall charge, Deborah. And some things that I've taken away from this conversation are, as I'm living into that charge and thinking about the role that we play at BPI and that many of our audience members play, one source of information is going to be your website. Looking at the reports that you all publish, the maps that you use, the dashboards that are there, the ability to raise particular concerns and larger concerns with you all by sending in complaints or using the portals in your website to be sharing information with your office. So we appreciate the work that you do in the service of improving our city government. And we're so grateful to have had you with us here this afternoon. Thank you so much for your service.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Have a nice afternoon.